All right, so when we talk about American imperialism, the Spanish-American War is a pretty good starting point here. This is a really key event. It marked a turning point in kind of how America thought of itself. Prior to the Spanish-American War, there were these consistent ideas of U.S. superiority, which would kind of manifest itself in imperialism. So, manifest destiny was the idea that America was destined to spread all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and that kind of what happened through things like the Mexican War and the Louisiana Purchase and annexation of Texas, and the presidency of James K. Polk. We also have the closing of the frontier in 1890. You might remember Frederick Jackson Turner, his frontier thesis, that the frontier was closed to settlement. So essentially, America had expanded as far as it could on the North American continent, which provided a reason for America to look beyond those borders. And then we also have, with the industrialization of the Gilded Age, ideas of social Darwinism, that wealth is proof of your superiority. In America, as a wealthier country or becoming a wealthier country, that was proof that we worked harder, that we were more in line with what you should be doing. So ideas of social Darwinism fueled imperialism because other places were seen as backwards or uncivilized. You also had this drive for an increase in U.S. military power. This kind of happens as far back as the 1860s when Matthew Perry, who's in the Navy, he visits Japan with U.S. ships. And the idea is to show Japan, sort of intimidate Japan with the power of the U.S. Navy and open up those ports for trade. So that's going to be an important idea, too, about trade and its influence in the world. You also have this influential book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, called by Alfred T. Mahan, in which he argued that sea power, naval power, was the key to defending trade routes around the world and colonies that you would have. Think about the British model of colonial rule. Also, kind of related to that, the United States went on a shipbuilding kind of binge in the 1870s and 1880s to become kind of in the top five most powerful navies in the world. They built a bunch of new battleships with new technology, that sort of thing. We also have previous expansions that kind of fueled imperialism, showing that we could do this. We have the annexation of Hawaii, where U.S. businessmen, particularly sugar and pineapple industries, kind of conspired to overthrow the native Hawaiian government with U.S. military help. And this was driven by profits and economics. Also, there was an attempt to use the Monroe Doctrine to increase influence in Latin America and places like Venezuela against Britain. And the United States had bought Alaska from Russia, which at the time was seen as a mistake, but would prove to become very valuable with oil and gold and those sorts of things. All right, so in terms of how the Spanish-American War impacted America's role in the world, looking forward effects here, we have an expansion of U.S. economic power. The U.S. owns plantations, the factories, and those kinds of things in Cuba. So the U.S. kind of business owners, not the U.S. government, but individuals, farmers and stuff, or large farms, own these plantations and kind of control the labor, kind of dominate the economy of Cuba. This does create a lot of resentment by Cubans because they feel like the U.S. is exploiting them and taking advantage of them. The same thing kind of happened with Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico was annexed as part of the United States after the Spanish-American War. However, it's not given equal weight. It's not a state or anything like that. It's just a kind of a place that the United States controls, particularly with the sugar industry. And so Puerto Rico kind of transformed into this place where there's sugar plantations all around, so much so that they have trouble providing food for the people who live in Puerto Rico. And that, again, creates resentment towards Americans. The Philippines kind of became dependent on not just U.S. goods, but also supplying U.S. So essentially, the Philippines kind of became really dependent on the U.S. in terms of imports and exports. The United States would receive timber and those kind of natural resources from the Philippines, and the Philippines would buy U.S. goods. So that's kind of one of the motivations for imperialism, was this idea of seeking new markets, and the Philippines provided that. There's also the open door notes with China, where the U.S. government, they negotiate to gain access to the Chinese markets, which had previously been closed to them after the Boxer Rebellion. So the U.S. kind of helps put down the Boxer Rebellion, and they kind of use that leverage to get the other European countries and Japan that are there to allow U.S. access to Chinese markets. Okay. Also, another effect here is this sense that America is kind of betraying its American ideals. It was a country that revolted against Britain and was opposed to colonialism. The idea of not having representation. They turn around and do the same thing to these other places. So it kind of shows America not really following its ideals of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal and that they're entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So the Platt Amendment was an amendment to not the U.S. Constitution, but to Cuba's Constitution. And it gave the U.S. kind of control of Cuba. It said that the United States could intervene in Cuba if they didn't like what Cuba was doing. Also, the Filipino Rebellion, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, they were rebelling because they felt like they just gotten rid of a colonial power in the Spanish-American War, and now they were stuck with a new kind of colonial ruler, the Americans. And the Americans were brutally treating these rebels, executing them and treating them just very, very, using a lot of brutal methods. And in America, you had people that were opposing the imperialism with groups like the Anti-Imperialist League. Some members of the Anti-Imperialist League were criticizing the U.S. as being hypocritical, that they weren't allowing people to rule themselves. However, in the Anti-Imperialist League, there were other people too who didn't really see it that way. They were opposed to imperialism because they felt like they didn't want to bring kind of non-English speaking groups like Filipinos or Cubans into the United States. So there's an element of racism in there too. But one of the things that some people argued was that the U.S. was being hypocritical against its ideals. All right, finally, the United States has a stronger military and kind of a feeling of nationalism again, right? In the Spanish-American War, when the Maine blows up, which is kind of the inciting event of the Spanish-American War, there's a lot of nationalism driven in part by the yellow journalism of the time, that kind of these sensationalized headlines and blaming Spain for blowing up this American ship in Havana Harbor. So people are kind of feeling strongly that the United States should go to war. It's like this feeling of nationalism in the United States is going to be strong. And after the Spanish-American War, because there were some problems with the military in terms of the ground troops, in terms of being able to avoid disease and not having adequate training and that sort of thing. So there was an increase in the size of the U.S. military, as well as kind of better training of soldiers and officers and leaders. So all soldiers would have kind of a standardized training, which would lead to a better, more disciplined military. And also, finally, this kind of modeling the American military after European military in terms of being centrally planned, having a group of military commanders, which the United States calls the Joint Chiefs, to kind of be in charge and plan military actions rather than being a hodgepodge of different things. So the United States ends up with a stronger military and therefore more power in the world. And also there's a greater desire on the part of Americans to kind of use that power as well.